Welcome to the Political Risk Podcast, an independent podcast focused on geopolitical risk to serve decision makers in specialty insurance markets, reinsurance, and beyond. I'm your host, David Benyon, and I'm joined by Michael Feller, a partner at Geopolitical Strategy, which provides advice on strategic matters for chief executives, boards, and investors. Michael is a former diplomat and senior civil servant based in Melbourne. He's held senior roles in Australia's Foreign Service, serving as a trade advisor, a diplomat in the Australian High Commission in Singapore, as a senior advisor within Australia's Prime Minister's Department, and as director at the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He was also a financial journalist, an investment strategist and mining prospector, and he has degrees in international relations and history. Today we're discussing the concept that we're living in a period of geopolitical interregnum. We'll explore what this might mean for the future and as a potentially useful framework for markets to think about the risk environment they face in the world today and tomorrow. Insurance audiences are more used to their own jargon, but perhaps less so that of international relations and historical terminology, and there's going to be a bit of that today. We'll talk about the decline of Pax Americana, by which we mean the liberal international order that's been led by the US since the end of World War II, and since the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991 has become a unipolar world. And before that, of course, there was Pax Britannica, when Britain was the global hegemon, for the century between the defeat of Napoleon through to the First World War. Nowadays, Pax Americana looks like it's in decline, but it's not clear what will happen next, with a discussion about the rise of China, or return to great power politics in a multipolar world. Well, first of all, Michael, thanks for joining me. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you, Dave.
So, Michael, interregnum. That's the end of one period of reigning hegemony, looking towards the possible start of another, whatever that may mean. Is this a useful lens to frame a way to look at geopolitical risk in the world today?
It is. So what we often see is people describe that this is the end of the US-led order, the end of globalization, the end of Pax Americana. But as it goes at any point in history, we really don't know in the moment where we are. But I think what we do know is that we're in some kind of holding pattern at the moment. We're not necessarily at the end or the beginning of a new era, but we're in the midst of a change. And I think that change really began, to my mind, in 2013. The moment that I keep thinking of was when Obama spoke about red lines, and then you had Assad in Syria step over those red lines and launch chemical weapons into civilian population. Others mark the period around Brexit, around Donald Trump, the financial crisis of 2008, COVID-19, or even Vladimir Putin's invasion. But either way, no matter what date you put on it, we are in a holding pattern. We are in this interregnum, if you will. And whether we return to an American-led global order, go to a Chinese-led order, go to something else entirely, none of us really know. And that's what's scary for policymakers and perhaps interesting for people in the political insurance space.
There are a few phrases in here that if you're a history nerd like I am, or if you're a geopolitical expert like you are, then we're acquainted with them. So to Pax Americana, this notion related to why it's particularly interesting interregnum this time. But I mean, the 19th century was Pax Britannica, and obviously there was, with a minor blip of one or two world wars, the handover from Pax Britannica to Pax Americana at least had the benefit of being two like-minded hegemons that could essentially pass the baton between them. And there wasn't this kind of fear about the power that you're handing it to. But with America stepping back, with the reluctance of the Obama administration to actually act on its red lines in Syria, America has a lot less appetite after the forever wars in Afghanistan and Iraq to intervene, particularly in places like the Middle East. In terms of the rise of China, whether or not we do end up with a Chinese century or not, there's a lot of talk now that actually we might not. China's got a lot of troubles itself, but it's certainly the power on the rise, and it's not a like-minded power, is it? We've got an era with a power that's an entirely different form of government and certainly not a friend to the West.
That's right. So there's two things. One is that the baton isn't being really passed to anyone. Certainly, the US doesn't want to willingly pass it to China. But even if they did, in say another scenario, is China really willing to take it up? They seem just as reluctant to intervene in events in the Middle East or events elsewhere in the world. So people, I think, quite rightly criticize the United States for not intervening more in the Middle East or Haiti or Guyana or any of these other flashpoints that we're seeing proliferate around the world. But it's not as if China, at least in a constructive way, is stepping into that void either. So we've seen political violence and political risk really rise over the last few years because, the cat's away and the mice will play and no one is going to rein them in.
You make a very good point. This idea that just because America is potentially taking a step back from its global policeperson, role, that China is a very different type of cat and it's not going to just step in and be the same type of power. Probably the Red Sea crisis is a good example of that at the moment, right? They have no interest in providing the same kind of international task force role that the US naturally steps into when there's a crisis like that.
And this is what I think is quite perplexing to a lot of people in the markets is that China relies far more on the Red Sea than the United States does. The United States conducts its trade with East Asia via the Pacific, with Europe via the Atlantic. There is some trade which ultimately reaches the US, of course, but beside its presence in the Persian Gulf and in Djibouti, which China, by the way, has a naval presence in both those locations. The US arguably doesn't have as much skin in the game as China does. And I know that China has allegedly negotiated a deal with the Houthis to avoid their ships being targeted, although there's been at least one prominent occasion where that hasn't been the case. And I think it was actually a Chinese vessel heading to Iran, ironically, that got hit.
But it's this idea that there's a void, there's a vacuum. China is not stepping into it. There's this, which generates, I think, which to your point, that the uncertainty of what happens next in this interregnum.
Yeah, that's right. Same goes for Europe. I know that a number of European countries have joined US-led task forces in the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea, but it's not exactly a presence that is deterring the Houthis by any means.
So moving on then, the period of interregnum is not just marked by perhaps a change in US policies that we might expect to see in the world, but also by changing attitudes towards the US as the dominant global power since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So whether we might see that through the WTO or sanctions busting or just kind of countries, for example, in the global south, their attitude towards the US. Are we seeing that change?
We certainly are, from friend and foe and frenemy alike. In no particular order, what comes to mind is in the friend category, you have a state like Israel that, has over the course of its history chosen to ignore US advice, but never to the extent that we're seeing between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Biden today. You have quite open, pointed commentary coming from the White House, and it's either ignored or just countered, or Netanyahu will go straight to the Republicans and attempt to play into the US political cycle. And I know that the United States has done exactly the same thing in Israel, but that perhaps illustrates the point. The fact that the United States feels it needs to politically intervene in that way shows that its writ is just being ignored in a way that is quite hard to imagine from, say, 10, 15 years ago. In the frenemy camp, let's say states like India, whilst engaging with the US, in the Indo-Pacific, in the Quad, on maritime issues, is quite happy to run the risk of future secondary sanctions by continuing to trade quite openly with Russia and also, for that matter, Iran. And then in the foes camp, of course, you have China, which at one level, due perhaps to China's own internal economic issues, you have Chinese companies towing the line at the individual level on Russian sanctions. Banking relationships have seemingly ended. Some of the trade between China and Russia is being routed through third countries in Central Asia, etc. But at the political level, Beijing is doubling down on its ties with Moscow, and quite openly so. Obviously, North Korea is another example of that. Although it's hard to see how much more coercion the United States can really apply to a place like Pyongyang doing business with Putin.
You mentioned secondary sanctions, and that has been in the news just in recent days. I mean, obviously, China's a huge country, but there are others. I'm thinking of the UAE, for example, where these countries are smaller. They like to be seen to play the part of a neutral. It's not our quarrel, and yet the US could be starting to tighten its attitude to secondary sanctions. It'd be interesting to see which way they jump, or if forced.
I suspect people in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, for that matter, they're very aware of their own leverage, though. So whilst the US could threaten secondary sanctions for trade with Russia, there's plenty of leverage that allies and quasi-allies in the Middle East have with the United States, and they only need to look at examples like Venezuela, which has comparatively little leverage with the United States, but has been quite openly flouting the conditions of its pause in sanctions from the US. So the Biden administration lifted sanctions on oil as part of a package that would see free and fair elections in Venezuela, and it seems by banning and jailing opposition figures, by threatening to invade Guyana, by, I think, jailing a senior Chevron executive. Caracas has, I think, really thumbed its nose at the United States and seems to be getting away with it, for now at least. And if I were in Abu Dhabi or another Gulf capital looking at that, I would say, well, I could probably get away with at least 10 times more than those guys.
So in some ways, we're in a situation last seen in the 1930s, potentially, where the unipolar world is over, it's multipolar, great powers are back, and that makes it difficult to crystal ball gaze and say what might happen next.
That's right, which again is why I like the interregnum framework, because it doesn't presuppose what era will come next. In the 1930s, you could say, if you weren't Winston Churchill, chances are the bigger threat that you saw at that time was from the Soviet Union rather than Nazi Germany. It seemed most people in the Anglosphere thought they could do a deal with Hitler, peace in our time, and so forth. The other interesting comparison with the 1930s is how their version of multilateralism was really put under strain by that new multipolar order they had. So the League of Nations failed to prevent World War II from breaking out. In hindsight, it was hard to see how it could have done any different, really. And perhaps people will say the same thing of the United Nations and the architecture that we have going for us now. But perhaps the worry to me, it's a little bit deeper than the individual institutions which are under threat. It's the norm. So in the last week, at the time of us speaking today, in the last week we've seen Israel bomb an Iranian embassy in Damascus, and we've seen Ecuador storm a Mexican embassy in Quito. Those norms around diplomatic inviolability, they're a lot deeper than something like the United Nations or something like an international treaty. It's sort of like the fundament of the global so-called rules-based order. Now it seems to be flouted from all directions. I know that there's never been a period in history where everyone's been law-abiding all the time and there hasn't been the occasional rogue state move. But it just does seem to me that the flouting of the norms and the conventions are becoming more frequent, more brazen, and there's been less consequence for those as the larger democracies focused more and more inwards on their own domestic politics, on their own eroding disconnect between the elite and the governed, and outside of US jobs numbers, the economic stagnation. If you ask many Americans, they would say that the US's economy, it's actually quite stagnant outside of the official figures. And certainly when you add in inflation, it doesn't feel to many people that times are great.
I think we've established it's pretty hard to crystal ball gaze and forecast what's coming next, but it's fun to try. So, is it possible to think about a few plausible scenarios for what could happen in broad terms in terms of US power and global stability?
At Geopolitical Strategy, we essentially see four broad plausible scenarios. One, which I think for many listeners, myself included, the ideal one, would be a return to Pax Americana, that the US regains its confidence, that the world listens again, and that we all go back to the globalization of the 1990s. And I think that, sadly, is not the most likely scenario. The second scenario, I think a lot of people talk about, also not the most likely, is a China-led order. Now, we spoke earlier about China having its own domestic troubles. Even if they didn't have their own domestic troubles, I just don't think, and this seems to be the view of people I speak to across Asia, that China wants to lead the world. China sees itself, yes, as the Middle Kingdom. Yes, it probably will be the world's biggest economy in nominal terms at some point. It already is in purchasing power terms, of course. It's a world leader in a whole host of things, including naval assets and manufacturing. But it doesn't want to be a global policeman in the way that the United States is. I don't think so. And I think that their actions in the Red Sea speak to their wider approach. The other scenario is famously Ian Bremmer's G0. Many of your listeners will have heard of that. It's sort of global anarchy. This is something I think Robert Kaplan and other American geopolitical experts talk about. Also, not so likely. Those situations, those periods of historical anarchy, luckily they don't tend to last that long. Yes, maybe the Dark Ages was an exception to that rule, but even during the Dark Ages, you did have empires and you did have strong governments. Nature abhors a vacuum and global power abhors a vacuum. I think the most likely scenario is a multipolar world, and that will probably be something akin to the 19th century again, in that you have spheres of influence. And it's very unpopular to talk openly about spheres of influence. This was one of the talking points that the West took to Vladimir Putin when he invaded Ukraine, that this is no longer an era of spheres of influence and that kind of thing. But nation states are behaving as if there are spheres of influence. So whether that's Ukraine, Russia, whether that's China's immediate neighborhood at least, whether that is France trying to retain its influence in West Africa, although I must say it seems to be fighting a losing battle there. You have the world already beginning to operate in blocks, and as maybe distasteful as that is to those of us who've grown up and profited in a rules-based unipolar order where everyone plays by the same rules, for most of human history, some semblance of multipolarity has existed because it's quite a stable system. And the era of the British Empire, the Brits were the first among equals, but by no means were they a unipolar power. They exercised power in concert with other European powers, most notably the French. And it was a fairly stable order between the Napoleonic era and World War I. And if we have 100 years of stability as a result going forward, maybe multipolarity isn't such a bad thing.
It's been so fashionable to use phrases like with Chinese characteristics for various concepts. And I do laugh at that idea a little bit. I think every country brings its own cultural way of doing things and its own baggage We know that the Chinese do bear grudges. For example, they haven't forgotten what the Brits did to them in Hong Kong, and essentially bossing them around their own doorstep a century and a half ago. I'm sure that's not been forgotten about in Beijing. But in some ways, they are bound by the same rules as everybody else, or they may not want to follow the rules, but the laws of physics apply regardless. And essentially, they operate in the same system as we do. And every country is different. But the idea that just because we're trying to be culturally sensitive to everybody across the world, the different rules magically apply to Beijing is somewhat delusional. So they will have certainly watched where we've gone wrong or where we've made mistakes, and they'll look at the British model of Pax Britannica and say, well, you could try and plant flags all over the globe and run a colonial empire. You didn't manage to hold on to it for more than a century. So that's not a successful, in the long-term view, way of being the global superpower. And they may well look at the Americans and say, well, you've had hundreds of military bases and you've dominated regions in forever wars across the Middle East and Central Asia and other places and the Balkans, and say, well, that's also potentially not a system we want to try and be the global policeman and replicate that either. We will have our own approach. So that's perhaps where you could say with Chinese characteristics, they will bring their own approach to things.
Absolutely. And if we know anything about the Chinese government, they're students of history. And, you only need to listen to any of Xi Jinping's speeches. They're peppered with historical references, historical poetry, and all sorts of interesting things. But I think they look at both the past and the present as perhaps a good guide to why they wouldn't want to be a US-style global policeman from the present. You only need to look at their problems in Pakistan with some of the Belt Road projects there and the risk to Chinese citizens operating in some of these places. I don't think that makes them want to go start sending their troops and administrators and paid workers to global hotspots unless it's absolutely paramount for Chinese interests.
When you mentioned the idea of a prolonged interregnum of instability, and however you prolong that out, whether it's a few years or a few decades, because we know that India is a rising power as well. And the Chinese are already clashing with India. We've seen that in recent weeks in terms of their, renaming towns provocatively in a border area they both claim. It's a nonsense to suggest that this is just a period where it's the West and China. You've got India as this elephant in the room that's going to be a great power, or it already is a great power, but it has even more potential as the 21st century continues.
India very much already, in my view, is a great power, and it behaves like one. And what I was maybe going to add to my comments on the Red Sea earlier is that, if there's been one maritime power that has been sending naval assets and making its presence known in that part of the world, it's India. They've been very active off the coast of Somalia, very active in the Gulf of Aden, and, they see the Indian Ocean as their lake. And, I'm sure the Chinese and many others, the French, disagree with that characterization, but it is the Indian Ocean, it's not the Chinese Ocean. And the issue of renaming cities in Arunachal Pradesh or South Tibet, as I think the Chinese call it, I don't put too much stock in that. You spoke about the laws of physics earlier and how they apply to everyone, and certainly the Himalayas, it's a bit of the physical truth that gets in the way. I don't see China bothering, frankly. They pretty much have what they need from the Himalayas, and that's controlling the sources of Asia's great rivers. On the Tibetan plateau, I don't think they need to go any further south to really have an enormous amount of leverage over Southeast Asia, South Asia. Also, the Chinese look at their own history, and they look at periods where China has run a large Eurasian empire beyond the Chinese Han heartlands. And those empires don't seem to be very stable. They don't last very long. The dynasty under the Mongols, I know that was led by Mongols, but the apparatus in many ways was Chinese. It didn't last very long, and it was unstable. Whereas other Chinese dynasties, which have been stable, which have been prosperous, tend to be confined to the homeland.
About spheres of influence, I think it probably applies to the Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal, as much as it does to the steppe and Ukraine between the West and Russia. Because, what happens in the Indian Ocean, you got to look places like the Strait of Malacca are going to be crucial between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. And I think India's great power status, when you were saying about them being much more active in the recent Red Sea crisis in terms of intervening using their naval power, a round of applause. It really is good to see them
Absolutely.
starting to live up to that great power role.
No, and I think not just for Indians, but probably most people on the planet, I think they would welcome a multipolar order because it doesn't just give more influence to the countries of the so-called global south, but I think to many people across the world, there is this instinct that is a more stable system, that is just going to be more durable and more robust and more resilient to shock than a unipolar system, which by its design is always going to be a little bit brittle because it only takes a change in Congress or a change in president to really shake things up in a way that a multipolar system is a bit more distributed in its risks and its pressure points.
On the spheres of influence then, so firstly, I think obviously every country has its own sovereignty and should be acknowledged in terms of the way it wants to jump in terms of its own foreign policy. And that's something that the Russians don't give Ukraine credit for. They see it as merely a pawn of the West. But it's interesting that to talk about this idea of spheres of influence. I mean, essentially, it's whether Ukraine falls within a Western sphere of influence or Vladimir Putin's. And Ukraine should have some choice in that question.
Absolutely. And the tragedy of Ukraine is that not only is the regional pole, Moscow, quite aggressive and conducts its business in a way that I certainly want to be anywhere near, but Ukraine also historically and geographically overlaps two spheres of influence. It overlaps the European sphere and the Russian sphere. And you can say that predates the present crisis. You look at old maps of where the Russian Empire ended and the Austro-Hungarian Empire began, and that is pretty much a line right through modern-day Ukraine, where to the west you have, the most ferocious defenders of Ukrainian sovereignty, and to the east you have that more ambivalent relationship with Russia.
So many of these towns have changed names. Lviv is also historically known as Lvov.
Or Lemberg.
Or Lemberg, exactly, yeah. So Galicia was the region, wasn't it, between
Right.
Austria and Russia. But it goes back even further. I mean, they used to call it a marsh, I think, back in medieval times, of border provinces that, I remember when I was at university, I studied Charlemagne, and you had a Frankish kingdom, but the authority, the sovereignty, it wasn't just a block of a different color on the map. It would fade out towards the edges of it. And the idea that you did have these provinces that were, the sovereignty was lesser in those. It was on the edge of one sphere of influence, but also on the edge of another. Let's conclude with, you've mentioned already that a stable multipolar order is perhaps the most likely scenario that we may have at this historical pivot point. But for insurers, for investors, for businesses, what should they consider at this interregnum point?
So without wanting to guarantee anything, of course, we really just don't know which way it will pivot. But say we do, as I suspect it does, enter ultimately a multipolar order, you can imagine insurers operating across the globe may need to start to focus on one or only several geographies. For many businesses already, they've found that it's impossible to work in both China and the United States, so they've had to choose one or the other. You've had private equity funds, for instance, split in half to exclusively focus on either the West or China. And for insurance, many of your listeners will have already left Russia, for instance. Doesn't mean that Russia has gone without insurance. It just means it's now local insurers doing the job. And it will be particularly interesting, I think, for people operating in those offshore locations, those reinsurance hubs like Bermuda and so forth, where there's sort of that view that you can do business with everybody in the world and everything's going to be okay, or companies that are now basing themselves in Singapore and Dubai for the same reason. I do wonder, is that sustainable? And I suspect over the long term, over the next 20-year horizon, probably not. It's going to be a choice of choosing your market based on which pole in the multipolar order you want to operate in. And it doesn't mean that you only need to operate in the West. Maybe you can imagine that operating in India and the West and the Middle East will continue to be possible. But certainly in the direction things are going, at least at the moment, until we achieve a bit more stability and a new normal of rules and commercial arrangements, I think it will be tough to have a thriving financial services business that's in New York, but also in Moscow and Beijing.
Michael, it's been really great having this conversation with you. I think we've covered a lot of ground. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you very much.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you gained some insights here on what the future may hold for firms doing international business in a changeable geopolitical landscape. There are some cautious causes for optimism, or at least being able to rub along and continue to do business internationally in a multipolar era, particularly given the rise of a relatively pragmatic great power like India. There are also some unpalatable truths for the international insurance and reinsurance industry, based as it is on a business model centred on the free flow of capital and global diversification. The insurance and reinsurance sector is certainly not immune to geopolitical trends, of spheres of influence, protectionism, trade wars, or friendshoring and nearshoring. Speaking of the value of understanding the geopolitical context, I can't recommend enough subscribing to Geopolitical Dispatch. That's the daily global intelligence and risk briefing put out by Michael and his colleagues. It's insightful, well crafted, and includes a for business perspective. It's well worth subscribing to by email and by Substack. That's Geopolitical Dispatch. Top tip for you to stay informed. Please tune in next time for a war risk episode, mostly marine war, focused on the Red Sea crisis, mostly, but with a bit of Ukraine, etc. thrown in. I've been your host, David Benyon, and I'd like to thank Michael Feller, my guest, for this episode. See you next time. Production was by Peter McGill, and Lawrence Durkin provided the music.